In this episode, I interview Aaron Gertler from the Center for Effective Altruism. This is All-in-One Financial with Bill Holliday. We discuss financial planning issues of investing, taxes, estate planning, insurance, and retirement, brought to you by AIO Financial, a fee-only financial planning firm working with clients all over the U.S. at AIOfinancial.com. All right, thank you for joining me on this episode. I have a good interview with Aaron Gertler. He is with the Center for Effective Altruism. He runs their forum and newsletter and helps with a wide range of projects there. He holds a BA from Yale University and wrote his thesis about how charities can improve their communication with donors. Let's go to the interview. Great. All right, Aaron, thank you very much for joining me today.
Great to be here, Bill. Thanks for having questions about effective altruism, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, let's start with that. How do you define effective altruism?
Yeah, so I think it's important that there are kind of two facets of effective altruism. The first is just that it's a set of ideas about how to use your resources, whether that's time or money or your particular set of skills, to make as much of an impact as you can on the world. So that's a set of ideas about how to do that is one aspect of effective altruism. And there's also a community of people, thousands of people around the globe, who have sort of taken up some of those ideas for themselves and are kind of working together on a bunch of different projects that are meant to be impactful in this way. So whether these are people who work at charities or who work doing charity research or who are just working regular jobs but donating a high percentage of their salary to further other projects. And of course, there's a social aspect to this as well. People meet up at conferences and events and virtual parties now in the year of COVID. So it's both of these things. It's both the set of ideas and then the community that's formed around these ideas for people who kind of share a common interest in doing good.
That's interesting. I'm new to discovering this community and I'm excited it exists because I do think there's a need for making it as effective as possible. I've been on a few boards that have been less than the most effective organizations.
Yeah, my origin story was that I was also very excited to discover this back in college in 2011, 2012, when I first came across it. I used to be the kind of kid who would wake up every morning and read the newsletter and then would read the political blogs and then would write down this long list of problems that I had this Word document that was just all the problems I see in the world and which one am I supposed to be fixing, with my one life. And I got really stressed about this sometimes because I just had this long list and no sense of how to prioritize among them, or like, it just seemed like it was way too much for any person to possibly do. And then fortunately, I figured out, oh, there's actually a whole lot of people who have the same set of concerns and who have thought about prioritization for years. And it started to seem a little bit more possible that we really could change the world for the better once I realized there were thousands of us as opposed to just me. And so that was a really good revelation.
Well, and I like the idea of being effective. I love the kudos and I like volunteering, but I think in my case, it's better for me and in a lot of the audience to raise funds and not be there actually providing the service. And it can be more efficient that way. And it's good to feel good about just quietly raising funds and sending them off than actually doing the community service yourself.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that people sometimes miss is that it's really good to have professionals who can work on a variety of things. I mean, just as you're a professional at your job and you might not necessarily want a volunteer coming in to help. It depends on where you work, of course, but say if you're in the financial industry, for example, probably the people who are going to do the best work of that are people who are being paid to do it full time. Similarly, what I want to do is say, okay, I probably should not be the person who's going to Kenya and trying to provide useful services in Kenya because I don't know anything about the language or the country. And instead, what I should probably be doing is trying to pay like experts and people who have years of on the ground experience, who are familiar with the literature and the kind of economics behind global development, and just say, no, you do it. And I'll stick to being a writer of email newsletters as I am for CEA here.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. For the Center of Effective Altruism, how long have you been with them? What's their background and what are their goals and missions?
Sure. So I think it might make more sense to start with a little bit more kind of about the effective altruism community and why this is such why we need a community, why this is like a really interesting problem of trying to maximize your impact. I think comparing it to investing might be instructive. If you're trying to do optimal investing, you're trying to make as much money as you can by investing money, there are a bunch of pretty well-known mechanisms by which you can do this, right? Like there are some arguments about whether the stock market is truly efficient, but you can assume that at least it is a market. There are lots of people who have lots of information that is revealed by their behavior. And ergo, you can assume that like the return you get on an investment in the stock market is like pretty predictable. Maybe not predictable is not the right word, but you have a sense that like everybody kind of has a sense of how to price things. If you gather all their knowledge together, you get a real sense of how valuable something is, what it's worth.
Sure.
Charity is not like that. Charity is not a market. They're just, most people are not in this, are not donating in order to maximize their impact. And so you end up with these causes that are wildly underfunded, or in some cases the reverse, a charity that's pretty big and popular, and yet it turns out their programs are absolutely useless. My favorite story about this is the Play Pump story, which you'll hear about in some books about effective altruism that you might read, which is a charity tried to set up a new kind of water pump. And they got tens of millions of dollars of funding to do this. They were widely celebrated. They had celebrity sponsors. And the idea was this cute little water pump that looked like a merry-go-round. And so kids would play on it, the idea was, and instead of people having to work really hard to pump water into the ground, you just have kids playing and spinning this thing around, and you just get water almost for free. And it looked great. The videos were amazing of kids playing on merry-go-rounds, and it was somehow connected to clean water. And so a lot of people just didn't ask too many questions. And then, of course, it turns out that if you want to have an efficient water pump that's really good at getting water into the ground, it should look more like a pump and less like a merry-go-round. These things were just like horrible. They broke down all the time. Kids didn't want to play on them because, of course, you have to like use a lot of force to pump water out of the ground. And so it's not like a merry-go-round. You're not spinning, you're pushing it. And so you ended up with like the adults in the community just spinning this thing around, like pushing on it. And it was just like this horrible thing that was much worse than the water pumps they already had in many cases. No one had really asked for this, but it looked good. And so it got a lot of investment. And that's sort of like the kind of thing we fight against, is trying to think, okay, let's not think too much about like the lovely pictures and the videos we see, but instead just think, what is the evidence we have that the money we give is really producing an impact for the people or the animals in some cases that we're trying to help?
Right.
So that's sort of like why this is difficult, is like you have to look past the usual metrics that you might look at and think, okay, like what's the bigger picture here? Like what actual evidence and knowledge do we have?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think you want it to be effective. You also don't want to be sucked in by a celebrity or a athlete who is pushing something. You want to know that the numbers make sense, that for your dollar, it's making as much of an impact as you can.
Exactly. Both that the numbers make sense, and in some cases, another tricky part is sometimes you just don't have numbers, right? Like with an investment, you put in your money, and at some point you either get your money back plus a little extra, or you don't. With the charity, you kind of give your money and you hope that something good happens, but how are you supposed to even measure what that is? Like, let's say that your greatest concern is stopping climate change, and you give to a charity that does work on climate change. You're often going to have a really hard time connecting their work to specific emissions reductions, and so you're sort of forced to rely on these rules of thumb about like, okay, what are some of the most effective ways to reduce climate change? Which charities seem to be doing a good job of promoting this? Like, which charities seem to have the ear of policymakers and really seem to be good at pushing their agendas forward? And this is a really legitimate set of questions to ask too, and it's a challenge to figure out which charities do the best work in policy, for example. And so Effective Altruism also has some ideas about this, but it's harder than just doing the numbers on a randomized controlled trial and saying, okay, for $300 I can buy 100 mosquito nets and they reduce the rate of malaria by this much. So it gets more and more advanced kind of the deeper you go.
Sure.
But getting back to the Center for Effective Altruism, because I realized that was a bit of a long digression. The Center for Effective Altruism sort of plays a community building role within the community. So there are a lot of different organizations that are connected to effective altruism in some way. There are charities like the Against Malaria Foundation or Give Directly that kind of do work on the ground that are really just helping people and animals directly. And they kind of, you just donate to them and they turn it into work. They turn it into output. There are also research organizations that are trying to figure out what some of the most effective things we can do. But if you give your money to them, they turn that into research and reports and ideas. And then at some point, ideally, someone figures out a way to actually implement the suggestions they're making. Or they'll evaluate existing charities and try to make recommendations about which ones you should support. So GiveWell is an example of this. They look at hundreds of charities, lots of different cause areas, and they picked a list of 8 top charities right now that they say we're very confident these are among the very best ones you can support. These are the ones we're comfortable recommending. And then they kind of say like, okay, we're not going to bother showing you what we think is the 20th best charity because we think that these top 8 still need tons of funding, like many millions of dollars worth of funding. And we prefer that you give your support here. And then there are sort of organizations that do the community side of this, which is how do we make it so more people are interested in this in the first place? Like, how are we trying to market effective altruism? How are we trying to present it in the media, for example? Or let's say at universities, if you're a college student who's interested in doing the most good, what are you supposed to do? Who's going to help you? And so the Center for Effective Altruism does a few activities that are related to this. First, we run a series of events for the community. So we host what were formerly in-person conferences, and of course are currently virtual conferences. We hope to be back in person soon, where people from every corner of the effective altruism community will come to these events and have a chance to meet up and network and listen to each other's latest research presented in a series of talks. So these are called the Effective Altruism Global Conferences, or in some cases EAGX, which is like our version of TEDx. It's a smaller conference. It's held in maybe a less busy location, but still gives people a chance to participate in person. So we coordinate these events. That's part of our work. We also help to support EA groups around the world. So many of these are based at universities and mostly involve undergraduates or graduate students. Some of them are based in cities and are just like, if you're in New York and you're interested in effective altruism, you can join the New York Effective Altruism Group. And then some of them are more based on kind of interests that people have in common and meet virtually. So if you're a lawyer and you're interested in kind of which legal questions and areas of legal research hold the most promise for furthering impactful causes, maybe you would join the Effective Altruism Legal Group or something like that. So we help to coordinate these groups. We provide funding to people who, so like this is a pretty rare opportunity. If you're a student and you're like the leader of your Effective Altruism group and you think you're doing a really good job, you might apply to us and say like, hey, we'd like a grant to actually like, keep this community going. Or like, hey, I, work in such and such a city, I lead the group here, and I think we could really build up the group if I was able to take off of work for 6 months and do this. And so we'll sometimes provide grants to people to like build these groups full time, because we think, hey, if you can convince 10 more people to like come in and decide that they really want to give a percentage of their income, or they're going to go out and seek jobs at these charities instead of, some other area of work, we think that's really worthwhile. And so we support groups, we provide them with resources and access to mentorship and access to speakers who can come in and give talks, that sort of thing.
And the groups are generally sharing resources, just discussing how they can be as effective as possible?
Yeah, so it depends really on kind of where you are in your career. So if you're a student, then the world's your oyster. There are lots of things you could do. You might end up working for a charity. You might end up getting switching your major and maybe deciding to get a PhD in some important research topic. Like maybe you end up getting a PhD in economics and you go to do work on you end up running some of the randomized controlled trials that help us get evidence on how to help people in the developing world. Or maybe you are just interested, you're not sure what you want to do yet. You just want to hang out with a group of people who share your interests and can help to guide you over the long run. And so student groups tend to be built around discussion, like kind of every year people come in who are new. And so you kind of want to help introduce them to the basics. And so there are often these introductory fellowships that are run to kind of lead people on a grand tour through the main cause areas and open questions in effective altruism. There's also just like a big social aspect, right? You're in college, you want to have fun, you want to hang out with people who, will have dorky philosophical discussions, or who kind of are familiar with all the latest dank effective altruism memes. They do exist. And then there's also like an aspect of mentorship and kind of getting help from experts. So there's getting speakers will come in who like work at a lot of the organizations that we think are especially impactful, and we'll talk about their work and sort of how they came to this career path and what advice they would give to students who want to follow a similar path. So it's sort of like, think of it as like career prep, mentorship, kind of getting ready for what you're going to do after school, while still hanging out with a community of people who share some of your interests. And there'll be retreats, and again, a lot of this is dependent on physical context, so this year is very different. But it's a mix of fun and sort of career preparation and being ready to make an impact, because we think that mostly students should be thinking about the future and not so worried about, should I donate money for my student job? It's like, well, yeah, you can do that, and that's really noble of you to do, but it's also totally fine to put that money away so you don't have to worry about having a giant debt when you're out of college, and you have more flexibility to do what you want to do.
So are the groups mostly focused on universities, or are there other, politicians or philanthropists or other people in these groups?
Moving on to like what a city group might look like. The university groups are probably the most common instance of this. Effective altruism definitely skews younger as a movement, because it's a pretty new movement. There aren't a lot of like elder statespeople around yet. But as far as city groups go, so let's say you have a bunch of people who already work at careers and they're trying to figure out how to further their own impact. Maybe you have a group of people meet up regularly to talk about, updates from charities that seem really promising, or it's sort of a similar idea in that you might still have guest speakers come in, you have people kind of sharing interesting research or news that seems relevant to making an impact. But maybe you're pretty settled in your career and you're not going to be like switching things right now, like you're pretty happy where you are. In that case, it becomes more about donating or maybe it's providing skilled volunteering. We definitely have people in the community who are like lawyers who will offer a bit of legal service to a charity that needs it, or people who will like offer, who just have corporate experience, will sit on the board of a freshly new incubated charity that maybe doesn't have people with a lot of business experience on its staff yet. So it's a mix more of donating and volunteering are more emphasized, and career changes are a bit less emphasized. Although there are definitely people who have careers where maybe if you take a slight shift in the direction that you're pursuing, you end up being able to make a much bigger impact. So let's say you mentioned politicians. Well, I don't think there are a lot of people who are effective altruists in elected office right now, but there are definitely people who work with politicians and work on policy. And there might be some question of, okay, you work in this policy area right now. Like, have you considered switching to this other area where we think that this particular idea holds a lot of promise, and if this particular law were passed in this country, we think it could have like an enormous impact.
Sure.
And so there are people who do work in a few countries that looks a bit like that.
That makes sense. So you do have a variety of different groups going on there that you're supporting. How do people find these groups or networks? Is that all through your website?
Yeah, so there's a kind of organization that we work with called the Effective Altruism Hub, maintains the best list of available groups. So if you just go to eahub.org/groups, you'll find a really big, it's not fully comprehensive because new orgs are being started all the time, but it'll be a pretty good indicator of like, is there a group in your local area? Is there one at your school? Is there one that kind of meets some interest that you have? And they have a nice tool you can use to kind of search for through a long list of groups. And that's where I would start out. You're also welcome if you're interested in resources. So beyond just groups, there are also like all these little sometimes the best thing you can do if you want to get involved is just like meet another person who has like a similar job or a similar set of expertise to you, and then has been a member of the community for longer and helped to advise you. And so these one-on-one connections are also pretty important to effective altruism. And if you're interested in finding someone like that, there's not a great resource for just like finding all the effective altruists in your network or whatever. But if you reach out to me, I'd be happy to try and make a connection. That's one of the things I do at the Center for Effective Altruism, is I just handle sort of various requests that come our way and try to like make connections within the community. So if you reach out to me at aaron@effectivealtruism.org, that'll be my email, and just like, introduce yourself, let me know what you're interested in. I can try to connect you to a relevant resource.
Great. AARON. I will put that in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Because you have a network or access to a big library of people.
Yeah, I'm not the most senior person in the movement by any means, far from it. But because of my work, I do things like, one of the things I do is to run the Effective Altruism Forum, where people discuss this sort of thing. And I help lots of people with forum-related matters. And I also send an email newsletter where I send kind of information about different projects within Effective Altruism to tens of thousands of people. And so I end up in contact with lots of different organizations and people through this work, and sort of have my ear to the ground as far as like where people can go if they want to learn more about a given topic or meet somebody who kind of meets a certain profile.
No, that sounds perfect. So the EA Hub for the groups, your email for connecting individually, are there other resources that people who are interested in connecting with other people involved with this should go? Are there?
Yeah, so people should keep an eye on our so I think signing up for the Effective Altruism newsletter is a pretty good start. You can put in the show notes. Basically, people will find a link in the show notes that they can use to connect to the Effective Altruism newsletter. This is a kind of a constant source of news and updates about opportunities to get connected to different things. In particular, we always share when there's another conference coming up. People who are interested in sort of what's coming up right now can also go to eaglobal.org. That's eaglobal.org, which is where we store information about the different conferences that we're running or being run by people we work with. So that's the event side of things. And yeah, those would be kind of the central resources. There's also the Effective Altruism Forum if you just want to like connect to people digitally and you're the kind of person who likes hanging out on chat boards and doing forum stuff. That's just forum.effectivealtruism.org. It's a lot of the content there is more created by people who have some experience in the space, so a lot of it might be pretty confusing if you're new. But we also have a nice pinned post at the top of that, which is just a set of resources that might be better for people who are getting started in this. But yeah, I think as you're getting connected to people, it can also help to just familiarize yourself with some of the basic ideas if you're not familiar yet. And so one thing you could do is try just reading a book. There are a couple of good books that I think introduce different aspects of this. So there's Doing Good Better. This is a book by William MacAskill, who's one of the co-founders of the Effective Altruism movement. He also founded the Center for Effective Altruism, an Oxford philosophy professor who has just kind of produced this great book-length introduction to some of the core ideas in effective altruism, written in 2015, but still basic ideas have not changed too much and is a great starting resource. It might be worth also talking a little bit about sort of some of the basic details of effective altruism, particularly some of the resources you can use to find organizations that are doing really effective work. So a big part of effective altruism is trying to find impactful organizations that are, that might need money or volunteer expertise. As I said, there's definitely, especially since this podcast is reaching a community of people who are more established professionals, as I mentioned, EA skews young. We definitely have a need for people who have just like strong operational experience or just like who know kind of how to run a corporate board. There are lots of, I've seen a lot of listings lately for organizations that are looking for people like that to come in and help advise. There's also, for example, the Charity Entrepreneurship, a group which runs sort of a little startup incubator, but for charities. And a lot of the charities that they work with end up needing advisors who can help out. So as far as finding organizations, there are a few resources I would recommend. So some of these are the people who do research on effective giving, who can just say, like, if you just say, hey, I want to make a donation to charity this year, what should I do? They can help you answer this question in a pretty straightforward way. Straightforward if your goals are straightforward, you can definitely go down the rabbit hole too.
Sure.
So these organizations would include, for example, GiveWell, which I mentioned before,
Right.
I think. They do global health and development charities. So if you want to do as much good as you can for just people who are living in some of the poorest places in the world, GiveWell is your best place to start. There's also animal charity evaluators. Something that's pretty common in the effective altruism movement is a lot of people are concerned about animal welfare. The idea being that, animals, especially farmed animals in particular, tend to be pretty neglected by charitable giving generally. But if you care a lot about just like, beings that can think and feel to some degree, this is an area of concern. So animal charity evaluators does a really good job of finding the best charities that are working to help animals. Climate change goes, something people ask us about a lot too. I would recommend looking at Founders Pledge. They actually have done reports on a few different cause areas, but I think I use them most often for their climate change reporting, where they've done a pretty good analysis of some of the most promising opportunities in that space and have a few recommended charities. So that's Founders Pledge. This will all be in the show notes.
Founders Pledge for climate change.
Founders Pledge, yeah. So they're an organization that works with basically startup founders that want to donate, and in the course of doing that, they provide lots of advisory resources that they share freely with the public too.
There's a big variety in the community of different focuses. It's not everyone wants to, grow the population or maximize the underdeveloped or health and development. There probably are.
Yeah, that's another thing that makes it a bit of a tougher thing than investment is you got to really look deep in yourself and ask, like, what do I actually want? And this is one of the most common things that comes up is people who say, like, I really want to help people in my city or my country, which is a completely legitimate goal. I should say there's like, you should value what you value. And, I don't think effective altruism would ever say that anyone is a bad person for wanting to donate to a local food bank. Obviously not. Like, obviously you have the best intentions there and you're probably going to feed someone who's hungry, and that's a worthwhile thing to do. But I also think that people tend to, when they really think about it, often they'll realize, like, it's not so much that, like, I care about this person who happens to live in San Diego with me more than I would care about somebody who lived in Los Angeles or Nairobi or, Beijing. It's more just like, I care about people and I want to help people as best I can. And really what people often want with a local organization is, hey, I want to be able to trust them. I want to be able to know they're doing the right thing. I want to be able to see their work with my own eyes. I want to be able to check on them and have that feeling of security that I like know what's going on here.
Right.
And a lot of people are pretty wary of donating to foreign charities because they've heard, like, okay, maybe I don't know this as well. I don't understand this space. I'm worried about corruption. I'm worried about, bad governments making it hard for my money to get through and really do good. Maybe they've heard some horror stories, like the plague pump story, for example. But that's, of course, where organizations like GiveWell come in to help you find the very best organizations that are doing work in the places where help is needed the most. Because let me tell you, the multipliers here are crazy. Like when, if you earn, say, $70,000 a year and you can provide a little bit of help and support someone who earns $700 a year, your money goes incredibly far.
Right.
In terms of like making someone's life better for a relatively small sacrifice.
Sure. I could see that. Or for even climate change issues where it's, if your dollar goes further, it may be more effective to donate out of the country.
Yeah, especially in these under, ill-defined spaces like climate change, where lots of different charities are trying to do a wildly different array of things, often without much data. You could easily say that, okay, this dollar of mine is going to prevent 10 times or 100 times as many emissions as I could get by donating to this other organization. All it takes is to find some people who have the scientific expertise, have done the research, and can help to advise me. And you're just not going to find those kind of 10x or 100x multipliers very often in other areas of life. And so to me, it's a really exciting opportunity to be able to find these experts in these pretty underexplored areas.
No, that I like your analogy with investments. I mean, it would be great if charities were it was more of an efficient market where the most effective would rise to the top and would be receiving the most funds, instead of this just whatever one you come across or whatever pulls your heartstrings, or if they send you a card, then that, connects you to it, and it makes you give to maybe not the most effective charities.
Exactly. That would be, we're a long, long way off from that, but sort of that's
Sure.
one of the things you could say Effective Altruism is trying to get a little bit closer to that, push us a little more in that direction.
Yeah. That's super. Anything else you want to add, Aaron? I think this has been really helpful.
I think we've only really scratched the surface here of some of the ideas that really help you figure out, I think one thing I haven't gotten into as much is the idea of kind of long-termism in these long-term cause areas. So we talked a bit about climate change as an example of this, where you're not immediately helping any particular person, but you're doing something that's likely to make the world a better place for generations to come. And I think that's one big area of effective altruism that's also worth exploring. Is there are a lot of people who think that this is some of the most impactful work you can do, is to try and figure out what are the big problems our descendants are going to encounter, and how can we help them prepare to better deal with that. So there are charities that, for example, do work in trying to reduce the risk of nuclear war, because there's actually still, a lot of work to be done in making sure that weapons are secure, that countries are demilitarizing, that certain conflict zones are not likely to erupt into some really devastating nuclear exchange. As we mentioned before, there's climate change. There's also people who are thinking about the risks from future technology. So you might have seen movies about, an artificial intelligence that goes crazy and tries to take over the world. And that's
Sure.
not, the movies are not very accurate, but there is some real concern about, okay, we keep building, technology that's smarter and smarter and more capable of taking independent action that its programmers wouldn't necessarily be able to predict. What are the different bad consequences that could follow through from that? Like, what does artificial intelligence look like in 20 years or 50 years? And if we keep, being surprised by the way that the technology we build affects us, we've seen hundreds of stories about technology having bad unintended consequences. What happens when our technology becomes more powerful and more independent of us? And there are a lot of people in effective altruism who are thinking really hard about questions related to, safeguarding us against what, we might be building in the future. So that's a big space. It's another thing to be worth thinking about. And this is where that other book I was going to mention came up. This is Toby Ord's book, The Precipice. So Toby Ord has sort of worked with Will MacAskill to set up effective altruism in the first place. And he's written this book, which is all about existential risk. The idea being like, what are all the different ways humans could go extinct? What do we know? And it's a grim topic, right? It's the cover of the book is this scary, darkened planet, at least the US edition. I think the UK edition looks nicer. But the basic idea is, what are all the ways that humans could go extinct, and how can we, if at all, how can we like prepare for this sort of thing? Like, are we going to get hit by an asteroid? What is the worst case scenario for climate change? Like, what is the worst case scenario for nuclear war? Like, what are the other super volcanoes? You name it, it's probably in the book somewhere.
Yeah.
Incredibly deeply researched. And while it is a bit scary, I like to think that all this stuff was already happening. The scary thing was not knowing about it. Knowledge is power and security to some degree. And I would recommend The Precipice to people who are interested in this topic. It's just really a marvelous book.
Yeah. How about overpopulation? Is that ever addressed?
So overpopulation is sort of it's a tricky thing, right? Because what is overpopulation? It's not like there's something inherently wrong about a lot of people being alive, but it's more like there are concerns associated with people being alive, many of which are environmental, right? The idea that the planet has some kind of limited carrying capacity or may run out of resources. And so I think what people are focused on more, to the extent that they think about these questions, are, all right, let's assume that like maybe population is not so much the problem, but how can we accommodate more people on the planet safely? How can we build better technology so that people emit less carbon per person, for example? How can we better develop agricultural technology to help support people? So there was a time, after all, when a lot of thinkers were predicting that like mass famine was the future of the human race, as recently as like 50 years ago or so. There were many, starvation was pretty common. You'd see all these scary news stories about places where food had just run out and millions of people were dying. But then all it kind of took was what we call the Green Revolution. Norman Borlaug is sort of the scientist who headlines this, but of course thousands of people were involved in producing much better crops and helping countries that formerly had like really poor agricultural yields be able to grow much more food to feed their populations. And it turned out that, okay, the problem was not that like 4 billion people was too many for the earth to hold. The problem was that we just had to figure out how to help them and how to like produce enough resources that everybody could live happily and safely. And so I'd say that overpopulation, there are some concerns associated with it, for sure, but it's important to remember that more people also means, more innovation, more people who might have the next great idea that's going to transform the world, more people who might be born to become like the next great leader of whatever country they happen to live in. And so you got to remember the good with the bad and think about, okay, given that people really want to have families and children and that sort of, people are going to exist on the planet, how do we make this as sustainable and enterprise as possible?
Do you have off the top of your head any resources for these bigger question charities?
So the bigger question, so organizations that do some work in this area. So there are a bunch of research organizations. I think starting probably with The Precipice is probably like a really good starting point because that book cites a lot of research that comes from some of these organizations and many more. There are also, I should mention the Effective Altruism Funds is a project that's sort of partnered up with the Center for Effective Altruism. We recently spun them out as an independent outfit, but they still work with us. And this is a way to donate that isn't just picking a charity. Instead, what you're doing is it's sort of like a hedge fund of sorts for charities. You're finding this team of expert managers who work on projects in a certain cause area. So you might find a bunch of people who are experts on animal projects or a bunch of people who are experts on sort of these long-term future issues. And you can put your money into like a pool of money, and then grant the management team of the fund will allocate grants from that pool of money to projects they think are promising. And they have a lot of time and expertise that helps them evaluate these projects well in a way that would be difficult for any individual to find. So sometimes they might say like, we're going to fund this one researcher because we really like these papers they wrote and we think that they can do more great research in this area, which is the sort of thing that, I would never have any hope of finding that person because I would have no idea. But instead I can give my money and say like, hey, I want to support good research in this area. Find me some people and, pass along the funds they need to continue their work. Just Google Effective Altruism Funds and you'll find that. That'll again be in the show notes. And you'll see more on the work they do and some of the grants they've made in the past. We try to be very transparent as far as like where we've given grants, sort of a reasoning behind them. It's a big world. And again, you can email me if you have questions about this. I know some of this is it's a lot to take in. Again, it's Aaron@effectivealtruism.org.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Aaron. I have come across that fund and I do like that you don't have to just put it into one charity or one even area of focus. You can spread it out and then you're right. You have this other level of experts to actually make the contributions.
Yeah, and I think that seems like a pretty good closing off point. I think that's we've given people a lot to think about, a lot of organizations to look at. I think what I would want to leave people with would be maybe this last message of just, this is you can have much more impact than you think. Because I think what I wish I had known earlier in my life was just that all of these things, I used to read these stories, again, these news stories about these horrible things happening in the world, and I think I would powerless. And I'm like, no, actually, an ordinary person who is willing to spend a few hours really thinking about kind of what they can do can have an enormous difference that they make in the world. We are more powerful than we think, especially because there's no market here. There's nobody trying to stop you from having an impact here. There's nobody who's trying to like counter invest against you. Instead, there's just a world of opportunities and people who are trying to help you find the best ones. And so I think just you can have more impact than you think is what I would say.
That's great. I appreciate your time, Aaron. This has given us a lot to think about. I appreciate you just discussing this whole community.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure, Bill. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, you know where to find me. And of course, I'll send you those links for the show notes.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Take care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you for listening to AIO Financial. I hope you found that to be useful. Aaron did provide a lot of resources that I will put in the show notes. So if you look at the blog page, AIO Financial blog /blog, and look for this episode, there'll be a lot of links located there. I think it's a great idea to more effectively donate or make a bigger impact with every donation dollar. Sustainable, responsible impact investing. It is at impactfinancialplanners.com/SRI ebook. Appreciate any comments, questions you have for us. You can comment where you find this in our video, blog, or podcast. Please reach out. You can find my email, phone at aiofinancial.com. So this is brought to you by AIO Financial. If you need help with any part of your finances, please contact AIO Financial for a free meeting, aiofinancial.com. Please subscribe, rate, makes it easier for other people to find this and move this process forward of effective altruism, of sustainable, responsible impact investing, expose it to more people. All right. Hope you are well. Take care.